Hi, it's Susan, and in this video, I'm really excited to share with you my latest sketchbook that I completed during Artful August. This is a yearly challenge that I created for myself and my painting community. The challenge runs through August, and it's called Artful August because it really is about being artful. And to me, artful means following those sparks of inspiration, being courageous with our creativity, and exploring different things, whether or not that is a different subject or different mediums, and it can be really open to anything. It is loosely based on a color theme each week, and I'm going to walk you through what my Artful August looked like, some of the growth that I feel like I had, and some insights behind the painting, as well as some of my favorite supplies that I ended up using throughout the month. So let's dive in. So every year for Artful August, I make a sketchbook, and this sketchbook happens to have this vellum type cover. This is the cover sheet that was inside the pad of paper that I used to make the pages of the sketchbook. And as you can see, it's see-through. So starting a sketchbook, especially one like this, is always going to be a little bit daunting because I overthink what I'm going to put on that first page. But I've realized that it has gotten easier. So if you want to know a few of the things I do to help me overcome that initial fear of the blank page, I'll leave a link to that video here. And you also get to see the process of painting this entry. So this started the week of orange, and I really put an emphasis this year on mixing the colors. Each color is a color that can be mixed. So this isn't my favorite entry. It's just the first entry in this sketchbook, and I didn't expect it to turn out well, and I don't love it. It's not my favorite, but I did feel like I was able to kick off the month and get it started and come out of a bit of a creative break. Now here we move on to the second entry, and as I'm getting started, I always feel a little bit unsure about what I want to paint. So sometimes I'll go back to something that I've painted before. In fact, one of the first YouTube videos I posted was peaches, so I decided to revisit it. I think that's where this came from. I just thought, it's been a couple years. How have I changed? How has my approach changed? And what would it look like if I painted the same subject again? And I also used a little bit of a different medium. I mixed mediums here. I used some water-soluble wax crayons, and that was fun. And then when I got to this day, which was the next day, I didn't really quite know what to do. And because this image bled over, I had this idea to just continue this with some abstract lines because I was thinking about doing color mixing, which is another thing that I tend to do in sketchbooks when I don't know what to do. So because I put an emphasis this year on mixing colors, I wanted to see what kind of oranges I could make from the red and the yellow I have in my palette, and also from an earthy red and a yellow. I also wanted to investigate this question of whether or not red is truly a primary, because it can be mixed from magenta and yellow. So I took my magenta and my yellow and I mixed a red, and I actually compared it to some of the other reds that I have in my palette. Now here we continue with the theme of orange, and for this one I explored using a foam stamp to create the watercolor texture in the back, and then I layered colored pencil and some water-soluble wax crayons over it, and I just kind of explored and went with a floral drawing for no really good reason. I just wanted to see what happened. So the next day I moved on to something that was a little bit more watercolor centered, and I did a mini landscape. And because I was concentrating on mixing, I thought it would be fun to do a limited palette. So here I used cerulean blue, a benzimita yellow, and a Venetian red. And I used these three colors to create this painting. And I feel like I was really surprised at the range of colors that I got here, especially this really lovely muted gray that I get from mixing cerulean blue and Venetian red. So that was quite a fun exploration for me. Then we moved into green week, and greens, of course, can be mixed from yellow and blue. But the first day I was feeling a little bit uninspired to do watercolor. And when that happens, I tend to go to a dry medium. So here I just did colored pencil with a few different greens, and I left it sketchy and loose. And I still feel like putting something down on paper means something. It doesn't have to be, for me, watercolor. It can be another medium as well, especially when it comes to Artful August, where it's really about exploring in many different mediums. In this day, I thought, I'm going to give these lily pads a try and do it with watercolor, and know that if I can't get it to look right with watercolor, I can always fall back on adding some lines with a dry media. And that's the way I tend to go, because I feel like dry media has the ability to pull my watercolors out from being a mess to being something that is more contained and refined. So I can put lines around it and containers around it and rein it in to a point where I feel like it looks better than it did before. So this is me playing with loose watercolors and combining some colored pencil. And at this point, I really felt like I really want to try and get these lily pads done in watercolor, all watercolor. It was a challenge to myself. And so I tried to do that here. And it just so happened that on this day, I only had 20 minutes. So I said, let me give myself 20 minutes. We'll do an exercise. I will paint for 20 minutes and I'm going to leave it. Wherever it lands, I will let it sit there and I'll let it be and I'll walk away from it. And so this is what came out. I really attempted to do a watercolor painting with fully watercolors and then to negative paint around the lily pads. And you can see it didn't work that well. And I only spent 20 minutes on it, so it wasn't very long, but I think this practice has helped me be okay with things that don't look good. And the more and more I expose myself to that, the easier it becomes to give myself permission to make a mess and to make things that don't look good and to really trust that I will be able to move on and continue to create and things will get better from that because I've learned from all of these practice sessions. So you can see here the next day, I told myself I would give it another try with a bit more time. And so I went with the same approach, wet on wet background, and then tried to carve out these lily pads. And it, again, didn't work that well. And so what I did was I fell back on using dry media and started to play with a palette. So I thought, how fun would it be if I just started to introduce this bright yellow, even though that's not really in my reference photo, and a turquoise and a magenta and a purple. So I took this opportunity to explore colors rather than trying to create this final piece that really looked the way I wanted to in my mind, because it doesn't look like the way I wanted it to look. So I took that opportunity to just do a different exploration. And at this point, at the end of Green Week, I really was focused on trying to really get these lily pads. And at this point, I sought out expertise from someone else. And I came across a tutorial that was within Tom Shepard's School of Watercolor. So I joined and I looked up the class and I painted from it. And it does not look anywhere near as beautiful as Tom's. But what I did acquire was a different perspective on approach. So it's really wonderful to look at how other people approach the same topic and see what order did they do things? How do they see different objects? How do they render them with watercolor? And I loved learning from him. It was so beautiful the way he did it. And mine didn't, again, quite turn out that way, but I gained a lot from this. And it really helped me get into a different mode of painting with watercolor. And something sort of clicked here after this, where I started to have more fun and be more free. And so then we entered Purple Week, and you can see from here on, I think there was a little bit of a tipping point where I started to become more comfortable with watercolor. I was getting into that stride of creating more consistently, and I was starting to be more playful and more courageous. So I started to play with much more watercolor, darker colors, and purples I mixed completely from the colors I have in my palette because I don't have any purples that come straight out of a tube. So all of these are mixed from a variation of ultramarine or Indian throne blue with a quinacridone magenta, for example. So they're all mixed, and I've started to add in gouache. I started to lift out little bits of paint to create some white spots, and I really started to play. I think Purple Week is really where I had the most fun. As you can see in these two entries, I started to really combine some of the things that I had been doing earlier in the month here. So it's a combination of using watercolor in a more dark way, a lot of washes, and then combining that water-soluble crayon into this and really being bold with my marks, not being afraid to use it to see the texture, to really use it to color in certain areas where it needed some little bright highlights. And this one I thought was going to be a lost cause because I was working it and working it and working it, and I felt like it wasn't going anywhere, so I just kept layering. And I think that they're part of being courageous with our art is to not be afraid of continuing to work at something, because I think sometimes it's easier to walk away, which is what I tend to do. And here on this one, I just kept layering. And the beauty of making my own sketchbook with watercolor paper that's quite thick, this is 140-pound watercolor paper, so it can handle all of that water and all of those layers. And so I think that's really great that I can do that and not be afraid of it bleeding through to the other side. So I just kept working at it, and this is what came out. And I surprised myself because I really kind of loved the way that it turned out, because it was different than what I've done before. And so from this, I became even more courageous and I did more wet on wet. I started to introduce more colors. I changed the type of purple for fun. Instead of a blue violet, I went more towards a magenta purple, and I started to play with these desert scenes from Anza Borrego during the super bloom. There are a ton of beautiful purples, oranges, and greens. And I started to become unafraid of making marks with the wax crayons, with different color combinations. You can see there's beginning to be a culmination of all of the things that I've explored before here in these later paintings in the month. So moving on with Purple Week, you can see I'm really trying to still explore this same idea, this same feeling. I really was enamored by it, and so I continued that. But I changed the types of purple I used here. I went lighter, I did a different subject, and I tried to capture the wispiness of wisteria. I don't think I did a great job because really it's more flowy than this. But I do like the marks that I made out of this. So on the last day of Purple Week, I think I really enjoyed this one so much and I wanted to give it another try because I had a different reference photo that was brighter and lighter. And so I took that one out and I tried again. So you can see I went really dark and then I went a little lighter. And then in this one, there's kind of a nice marriage of those two. There's darks and there's lights, and I feel like that's where the experience for myself builds and it brings me to different points. And I think this couldn't have come out unless I did those other ones. And so here I really continue to explore that same idea, just with a different color palette. And maybe it's a little bit more refined, I suppose you could say. Now the last week is gray, and in this week I also mixed all my grays, so none of these grays are coming out of the tube and they're all mixed. This is a French ultramarine and burnt sienna mix with a little bit of that wax crayon and a little bit of gouache. I love the granulation that happened here. It kind of creates a texture on the page that I wasn't expecting. This one was interesting because I was actually teaching a friend while I was doing this, so I didn't actually know how this would come out. But there was a part of me that was going to release expectations. I just thought, whatever comes out is fine, since I'm talking and showing and demonstrating to someone next to me as I'm doing this. But it actually turned out okay, and it looked somewhat like clouds. This just came out of my brain. I wasn't using a reference photo. I was just trying to show different techniques of lifting and softening edges and mixing grays. This one was done from a reference photo, and I just saw a really ominous sky, and I thought, let me put that next to this one and do a darker version of it. And I don't love how this turned out, but I do love that I got to play with grays and mixing more and being more bold with the colors. Again, it's me going darker than I'm comfortable with. So taking myself out of my comfort zone and really trying things out that I haven't done before. Now, for some reason or other, I decided that this cat felt inspiring. And so again, just following those little sparks of inspiration. And I wanted to try and capture that fluffy feel with wet on wet. And that was really the intent here. And we are doing gray. So I thought, let me try and mix a black, a dark, dark, dark gray, almost black, and it worked. This is a phthalo green and a crimson red, and it created this really beautiful dark black. I thought they would separate. I thought I would lean more green or lean more red, but it really turned out quite nice and neutral, and that also surprised me. But I had fun with this one, and I really enjoyed trying to capture that feeling of fur with watercolor techniques. It's really the perfect technique to do when you're doing something fluffy and soft. Then the next day I thought I wanted to try something less literal and do something a little bit more abstract. So I took this snowy mountaintop and I tried to abstract the shapes as much as possible. That was my challenge to myself. Can I mix a gray? Can I show that there's snow on a mountain by using really abstract marks and not get too tied up in the details? I'm always challenging myself to do things like that because I feel like that's the kind of loose painting I want to do better. And so you can see if you really zoom into these marks that they're all quite abstract and a little bit large, not so fine and not so detailed. That includes the way I put down the crayon marks. Sometimes they're just, big strokes. Like here, it's just one stroke. And I love trying to embody that feeling. And it's something that I think I'm always challenging myself to do because it feels fun and it feels loose. And I want to see if I can capture the essence of things without really going in there and doing all these tiny strokes. So this brings me to the last piece of the sketchbook, and that's still in gray week, but you could see I took the gray and I let it be more blue. And I actually introduced some blue in here just because I felt like it. And I think what this is doing and what it shows me is that I have really gotten to a point where I'm okay with expanding, exploring, and changing the rules for myself and just seeing what comes out. There's a reason why I picked butterflies, and that's because I started with butterflies and they looked like this. And I wanted to see what my approach to butterflies would be at the end of the month, which looks more like this. And you can see that there's a difference because when I started, I think doing something without a background, with less watercolor on the paper and a lot more textured dry media line work means that it's a little bit more timid. I don't want to cover the whole page. I kind of am doing something quick and a little bit light-handed, but doing something like this requires more time and more layering, more working with water, more of pushing myself to let go. You can see there's splatters. You can see here I've even dropped in some Brusho, which is crystallized watercolor to create texture, as well as white gouache. So there's a lot of just experimentation going on here. This is not my favorite piece. I think actually my favorite pieces are during Purple Week, but what this piece embodies for me and what it shows me is how much I grew during the month. So because I love knowing what supplies other artists use, here are the supplies that I reached for the most during the month of Artful August. Of course, I have my watercolors. I will link a video here where I shared the colors in my current palette and how I selected them. Next up are the water-soluble wax pastels that I kept mentioning when I was doing the flip through. These ones are the Neo Color 2 by Caran d'Ache. Hopefully I'm not butchering the pronunciation. And next up we have colored pencils by the same brand. Any colored pencils will do. I just happen to have these because they were a gift from a friend. And of course I have my watercolor brushes. The ones I use the most are a size 10 and a size 4. I used pencil. I love my black wings, but honestly, any pencil is going to work. I found myself using a lot of masking tape to create nice, clean borders. Next up is Brusho, which I mentioned I used in the last spread. Brusho is really fun. It's just crystallized pigment powder. And of course, I have white gouache, which I used a lot of to create those opaque white marks. And last up is a supply that is not obvious in the flip through, and that's fixative. I was getting some transfer from using the water-soluble wax pastel, and it would transfer onto the page across from it. So I started to use fixative to prevent that rubbing and transfer of color. Thank you so much for coming with me on this tour of my Artful August sketchbook. Hopefully you got some inspiration or maybe information out of it that you can take with you into your own creative practice. Let me know if you're working through a sketchbook currently or you've just finished one. I'd love to know. And of course, if you have any questions about mine, leave them in the comments below as well. I'll see you in the next video.